And my name is Joyce Raimondo, and I'm the education coordinator at the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. We're a national landmark in New York, and we're located about 100 miles east of New York City. And the Pollock-Krasner House is in an area in East Hampton known as the Springs. And historically, the Springs was a haven for artists. And artists began coming to the East End of Long Island in the late 1800s, as soon as the Long Island Railroad could easily transport people to the area. Today, I am very pleased to present to you three couples, including Pollock and Krasner. So Lee was very active in the art world in New York City, and she was in an exhibition at Macmillan Gallery, and she had never really heard of Jackson Pollock. She wasn't familiar with his work. So she was curious, and she, unannounced, went to his studio, which was his apartment, and the rest was history. They hit it off because they had a lot in common, of course, as creative artists. Now, that's one story about how they met. The other story is, which Lee typically didn't kind of emphasize, is that they actually met several years before. They had an encounter at a party in 1936, and they were dancing. Pollock was drunk. The story goes he stepped on a foot. He was inappropriate, making advances towards her. That's another story. But usually in an interview, when people asked Lee how they met, she would usually cite that it was through this exhibition at Macmillan Gallery. So they were living together on 8th Street in New York City, and they came out here to visit to the East End of Long Island, and they decided to move here. Now, this was a very, very small town. It was very rural. There were only 200 people in the entire town. So, and during that era, it really wouldn't have gone over well if they weren't married. So they decided to get married after they moved to the Springs. They actually got married at Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan. Lee was Jewish. Pollock was not religious, but he wanted to get married in a church. Helen Harrison, the former director, once told me that there was a quote that he said, something like, "I don't want to be like a dog with a dog tag. I want to get married in a church." So before they got married, Lee knew that Pollock was a drinker, and she figured she could handle that. And Pollock had a serious alcohol problem. Early on, he sought medical attention, and he was hospitalized at one point. He was medicated at one point, and he was also seeing a psychiatrist. So he was troubled with alcoholism. So as a married couple, they decided that Pollock would be the breadwinner, as they said in those days, which meant he would be the earner, and Lee would support his career. Now, I'm showing you this picture here of Peggy Guggenheim with Jackson Pollock, because Peggy Guggenheim was Jackson Pollock's patron. But who secured these amazing deals for Pollock? It was Lee who did the negotiating. So Lee managed Pollock's career, and she secured a down payment loan from Peggy Guggenheim so they could buy the property in the Springs. And Peggy also gave Pollock a monthly stipend from 1943 to 1947. Now, during this time, Lee, when they were married, Lee did not promote her own career as an artist. She focused on promoting Pollock so he would become successful. But she always painted, she always made her art. And, life was good. They had 2 dogs. Pollock had his pet crow. They didn't have children. Pollock wanted children. Lee did not want children. And almost all of the abstract expressionist female artists of that era, none of them had children, with one exception. And there was another artist who had a stepchild, but most of the females chose not to have children. During that era, Of course, there wouldn't have been a lot of support for a female artist if she had children and also wanted to paint. And Lee had a lot of responsibility. She was making her own art. She was also managing Pollock's career. And she was also kind of taking care of Pollock in many ways. You know, he was troubled. Now, sometimes, you know, when we look back on other periods of time and we sort of take our own values, our own culture that we live in, where today women have more freedom, more rights, we might overlay that onto a past era. Then that's a whole other big topic. But Lee herself never expressed outwardly any resentment towards Jackson Pollock and the fact that she was managing his career and not promoting her own. So I'm showing this painting here. This is one of Pollock's early works from 1942-43, and it shows male and female in an abstract way. Right? He's drawing from his subconscious. So I want to hear from you, our participants. What what do you make of this? The male is on the right, the female is on the left. What is he showing us about the male and the let's start with that. How is he presenting the male? What do you see there? Anybody? You can just unmute. Literally, what do you see on the right side? You see that yellow head up there, and then the body.
Number. They look like, is that numbers?
Yes, Bernice, it's numbers.
0 plus, mathematics,
Mhm.
money. He did the money.
Could be the money, could be the analytical, could be the
Hmm.
number. You know, these are things that it's a stereotypical thing that men would be
Hmm.
associated with being more logical, more analytical. It's a
Hmm.
rectangle, right? It's
Yeah.
black, it's a dark color. These are things that are typically masculine. Now,
Hmm.
Lee, on the other hand, or not, I don't, excuse me, that was wrong. Not Lee. The female, on the other hand, is shown with red, curvy breast, uh,
Yeah.
feminine eyelashes, right?
Hmm.
So it's sort of stereotypical. The red is like more emotional, it's more passionate. The curvy lines are more feminine. And I think it's interesting. In some ways, they did have a traditional relationship. The female supporting the male, uh, sometimes entertaining, having people over, collectors, dealers, other artists to help promote Pollock's career, being in a supportive role towards her husband, right? Now, in other ways, they didn't have a traditional marriage because traditional would have meant that Lee was home with children at that time, right? Also, Lee didn't take Pollock's last name, which was really, really rare in those days. So, what was their creative relationship? Did they influence each other's work? Did they talk about art? So, yes, they did. They did have a really fruitful dialogue about art as two artists. And Lee was typically more verbal and more, um, you know, she could give feedback a little more thoroughly than Pollock could. Not sure if thorough is exactly the right word. But Lee was also inspired and influenced by Pollock. Pollock's work is very free, very expressive, and in some ways, this helped open up Lee. So here's an example of her early work where you could see it starts to become looser and more expressive. You see the drips, you see the brushstroke, you see it's a little more fluid. So Pollock was working in this, the first year Pollock worked in a small room upstairs in the house, and then he moved into the barn, which he used as a studio. And Lee was working in that upstairs room in the house. Sometimes it was so cold, Lee would work downstairs. Um, and there's photos, famous photos of her down there with one of her artworks. After Pollock's death in 1956, Lee used this barn studio. So when you go in there today as a visitor, you can see evidence of both of these great artists in this barn studio, but they didn't paint in the studio at the same time. So here's Pollock doing his famous drip painting technique. Now, Pollock had 2 years of sobriety from 1948 to 50. He was under the care of a psychiatrist, and he was doing really, really well. And he had this radical breakthrough of drip painting, placing the canvas on the floor, working from all 4 sides, dripping paint from sticks, using the paintbrush as a stick at times, using house paint. This is action painting, right? 100% abstract art, moving as he works, and the movement is evidenced in his final product. And here's an example of his iconic drip painting, which is at the Met in New York City, and it's very, very large. It's about 18 feet wide. So everything was going well. Pollock catapults to fame. He's featured in Life magazine. It says, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? And all of the other abstract artists, their prices rise. They start to get notoriety too, because Jackson Pollock was the front runner. Now, when Pollock was doing this drip painting, he was, you could say the expression, he put himself out on a limb. It's a creative journey into the unknown, right? It's not readily accepted by everyone, by the critics. Some people thought it was, championed it. Some people didn't. But he was so vulnerable. In my opinion, Lee recalls him actually asking her, is this a painting? So not, is this a good painting? Is this a painting? So it shows how really groundbreaking his technique was. And when I say vulnerable, what I meant by that was that when you are out of your comfort zone, when you're an artist and you put yourself into the unknown and you're pushing boundaries, there certainly is an aspect of vulnerability to that. So what about sexism, right? So some people say, oh, when Lee was with Pollock, she didn't paint and he told her not to paint or whatever, all these stories, but none of that is true. Lee always painted. In fact, she said, Jackson always treated me as an artist. He always acknowledged, was aware of what I was doing. I was a painter before I knew him, and he knew that. And when we were together, I couldn't have stayed with him one day if he didn't treat me as a painter. So Lee had there was a short period she had a little block and she didn't paint for, I don't really know how long, but a short period. And I think sometimes people confuse that with her not painting because of Pollock. So even though Lee and Pollock had this symbiotic relationship with their creativity, Lee met with a lot of sexism during that era. And this is a whole other topic, but I'm just going to touch upon it. This is a very famous photograph of the artists of abstract expressionists, printed in Life magazine in 1951. And this group of artists wrote a letter to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, rebelling against the fact that they didn't include in current painting these American artists. So Lee recalls that she got a call and the person said, oh, could I speak to Pollock? And she passed the phone. And then she said to Pollock, oh, who was that? And he said, oh, it's so-and-so asking me to sign this letter. And so my point is with this is that the women were completely left out. And Lee was like, well, why isn't he asking me to sign the letter? Like, I've been active as an artist all these years. So you could see here the level of exclusion, except for that one woman, Hedda Stern, and I can't tell you why she's there. I asked Helen Harrison, the former director, there was no clear answer. Okay, but this is the iconic photograph of these very, very famous abstract expressionists with Pollock in the center. Okay. But Lee says, I couldn't run out and do a one-woman job on the sexist aspects of the art world, continue my painting, and stay in the role I was as Mrs. Pollock. What I considered important was that I was able to work and other things would have to take their turn. And there she is in 1961 in the Barn studio. This was taken by Hans Namath, and it's a detail of the full photo. So here's the tragic part of this story. Pollock is doing well. He's famous. He's earning a good living. Their income was above the average income of a household in the United States at that time. And Hans Namath, the famous photographer, is filming Pollock outdoors. Lee has company over and she made a nice dinner. And Pollock came into the house, poured himself a glass of bourbon. He got into an argument with Namath and he flipped the dinner table. And Lee, of course, looked on in horror. And from that moment on, he declined into active alcoholism and he never regained his sobriety. So we can only imagine how horrific that was for Lee and how heartbreaking. Following Lee, Pollock started an affair with Ruth Kligman, a younger woman. And this is the last photograph of Pollock with his mistress. And on this evening, Pollock invited Ruth Kligman and her friend Edith Metzger to go to a party, and they died in a fatal crash as a result of the fact that Pollock was drinking and driving. And I'm not going to go into the details of the crash because it's beyond the scope of the talk. But Lee wasn't there. She was in Paris. She had planned the trip to, to go to Paris and also probably to get a break. And this is pretty. Now, you can imagine they're on the property in Pollock's and Lee's house, right? She's sleeping in Lee's bed. This is a small community, and it's a relatively small community of artists. So I don't know about you. I'm just projecting my own feelings now. I imagine this was really humiliating for Lee. It's like in her face. That's just me. So in 1956, Pollock crashes the car, and he was 44 years old. Now, this was a painting that Lee had in the upstairs studio before she left for Paris. It was unfinished, and she said to Pollock, that painting is troubling me. And he said, oh, I'm paraphrasing right now. He said, oh, don't worry about it. You'll finish it when you come home. But it's pretty eerie because she calls it prophecy, and she does finish it when she came home. But it does look like a prophecy. So we see there's a little eye on the top right. And I wonder, is that like the eye of knowing, the seeing in the future, the prophecy? Is it the evil eye? Is it an eye of protection? So we can wonder about that. And then these, what appears to be limbs or body parts of fleshy paint, it looks mangled and bloody. So it's almost like she had a premonition, in my opinion. Now, after Pollock died, Lee sought therapy because she, from what I understand, she felt guilty. She felt remorse, right? That she wasn't there and he had the accident. But I also know for sure that when someone is an alcoholic, one cannot control their drinking. One cannot cure their drinking. And one cannot save someone, right? If that was the case, we wouldn't have these tragic results, right? We wouldn't be, let me let this person in. So this is the kind of drawing Lee would have been doing with a psychiatrist, where you do these free flow drawings and then you discuss them as a way of tapping into your unconscious mind, what's going on that maybe you're not even aware of. We're not sure if this was before Pollock's death or after. And 1 year after Pollock's death, Lee resumes her art in the Barnes studio. This was one of the first paintings she made. It's called The Seasons. It's very large. It's at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And she says, painting is not separate from life. It is like asking, do I want to live? And my answer is yes. And I paint. So I don't know if that quote was from before or after 1957, but I put it here because, Lee continued to paint, and her paintings became very vibrant and very joyful celebrations of nature eventually. But she also painted through her grief. 3 years later, her mom died, and she did this series called the Umber series, where she had insomnia. She would go into the studio and paint. And because she couldn't see at night, they were all dark and brown colors, and they're really expressing and releasing her grief. And Lee serves as, in my opinion, as a shining example of a woman, a human being, who has incredible resilience. And in the destructive wake of alcoholism, right, she continued. She had creative drive. Not only did she do her own art and become very successful, she also helped, at the early days, she helped drive up the prices of abstract expressionism. Because after Pollock died, I forget which museum it was, they wanted to buy one of his artworks. And she said, no, that price is too low. She was very good at negotiating. And then they came back with an offer of a higher price. And because of this type of thing, as Pollock's prices rose, so did all the other abstract expressionists. Their prices rose as well. Now, what did she do with all of that wealth of Pollock's paintings, the estate? She didn't give any paintings to his family. She created the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, which gives grants to artists, and it's still active today. So that's an endowment. Lee also ensured, under the auspices of Stony Brook University, that the site would become a museum, a study center, and a national landmark. So in that sense, I feel Lee was an incredibly giving person with vision. This presentation was created by Esperanza Leon, the co-president of the Brooks Park Home and Studio. We gave this presentation on Friday night.
You walk farther along and you encounter this striking structure with the iconic sawtooth roof. And then, even upon entering that building and finding this environment inside, you think, there's nothing special about this place. Well, that's basically what the town did. They were going to demolish these buildings despite this. This actually was a picture taken around the time of the purchase. So to think that there was this dismissiveness is astounding. Especially when it just seems impossible to believe that they weren't aware of the property's history. This is a real estate listing, and that they wouldn't want to preserve the buildings knowing of that history. So the threat of demolition was imminent then, but fortunately it was landmarked. Then again in 2020, it almost happened again, with the town realizing, well, we haven't preserved these buildings, they're really falling apart, we're going to have to demolish them. Fortunately, again, community members came forward and stopped that. That was deferred. But the threat of demolition lingers to this day, and perhaps I can fill you in more on that. But let's go back farther in time. Because as you can read in this real estate listing, the history of this place, which is tied to the history, really integrally to the history of East Hampton and to a world-renowned art movement, which we are in this place that is so much, I mean, it's a historic, national historic landmark because of abstract expressionism. The Neck Path properties history began actually with Charlotte and Jim in Montauk. I love this picture, by the way. So, recognize anybody here? So Charlotte and Jim met in Washington, D.C. during World War II. Together they moved to New York City, and they rented the studio apartment on A Street, which you saw the picture earlier, I think. That was once occupied by their friends. They were already friends of Lee-Krasner and Jackson Pollock. Just like their counterparts, they established studios on Eastern Long Island. They came to Montauk. They acquired 3 buildings on a bluff west of Rocky Point in 1949. So not long after, Joyce, what was the year that they?
1945.
45, so 4 years, okay. So here they are with Pollock in the house in a photo taken in 1950 by Hans Namath. That man was everywhere, Hans Namath, huh? There it is. So this was the barn that was on the bluff, lower down on the bluff, that served as his and hers studios. And the little cottage was for guests. It was their guest cottage. And so Pollock and Krasner would go out and visit in Montauk and, you know, would get late or something like that. And they would stay in this little cottage. There was no running water, mind you, in any of these buildings. I think it was a pump in the house, which was farther up on the bluff. This is the house.
There's a stupid question. Is this a photo or a painting?
So the photos were taken, I think these are coming from 35 millimeter slides that are in the Archives of American Art. And Helen Harrison took these, and I think they're somehow kind of solarized, or, you know, because they're not digitized in the traditional way. So I think somehow she photographed them or captured them. So yeah, they're a little bit funky, but yes, that's the light out here, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. So the enjoyment of this Montauk home came to an end on the very last day of August in 1954 when Hurricane Carol made landfall. This house on the bluff and the little cottage from the previous picture survived, but Charlotte and Jim lost artworks that were in the barn, which was completely destroyed. There are pictures of that, actually, but I didn't include them here. And I'm not sure. I think this picture may have been after the hurricane even. So what I think is notable is that Charlotte and Jim had chosen a remote, secluded place to live and work in seasonally in Montauk since 1949. But they hadn't been able to, they bought the buildings, but they didn't own the land. So once the hurricane happened, they still owned buildings, but I think the land was being redeveloped. So they had the opportunity to buy this large tract of land in Springs in 1956, where they'd be closer to their friends, but it was still tucked away in the woods. And they did what traditionally locals did. They moved the buildings, but this is the best part, everybody. They moved the house and the cottage by barge across Nepegue Bay. There it is. I love that picture. It was Jeffrey Potter who did the barging, and Kennelly Brothers from Southampton, I think, was the house mover. And the picture on the right, it was, I think, when they arrived in Springs, was taken by Ibram Lassow, the sculptor. So, let's see. Yeah, and this is a photo from Ibram too. So in Springs, as I was saying, Charlotte and Jim found a quiet, contemplative space, I think not dissimilar to where they had been out in Montauk. I mean, I think it's interesting to think that they chose these places that were more remote. And in Montauk, they were definitely detached, but still, they weren't reclusive people. They were just, this kind of space was well suited to their gentle personalities. So it's really a contrast to what you were just hearing from Joyce. They would ultimately live and work on Neck Path, so they moved these houses to the 11 acres on Neck Path, and they would live there and work there for the rest of their lives, and full-time actually beginning in the 1980s. So I want to then delve a little bit into the artwork. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of Charlotte Park. Anybody? Yes? Well, I know you are. So there's a wonderful exhibition, and we'll talk about it more, currently at the Leiber Collection of both Charlotte and Jim's work. Charlotte exhibited actively, and this is something that's very similar to what you were describing with Lee and Pollock, is that while Charlotte exhibited actively in the 50s and it was included in exhibitions at the Whitney Museum, Guildhall, then gallery shows, she devoted herself to her practice throughout her life, but she did take a step back in the 60s to support her husband's career. You know, I think basically it was kind of like, your career is more lucrative, I will support you in what you do. I mean, it's not unlike what you just described. Not to dilute their, you know, let's let him make the money, because it seemed like the easier way to go. She didn't exhibit frequently again until the 1970s, beginning with a solo exhibition at the Elaine Benson Gallery, if you remember the Elaine Benson Gallery in Bridgehampton, and then exhibited through the 70s, a little bit in the 80s. Her work, though, has now been revisited and is being more recognized, including with exhibitions. Actually here, she had a posthumous show at the Pollock-Krasner House in 2013, the Denver Art Museum, and then her work is represented at the Barry Campbell Gallery in New York. And most recently, if any of you saw, there was a really beautiful exhibition at the Parish Art Museum just last year, which ended earlier this year in the spring. And that's a picture of her in Montauk that was not on Neck Path. So just a few examples of her work. This is early work. She primarily worked in this monochromatic palette, blacks and whites. It's from 1950. And then turned to color later in that decade with a style that evokes nature, organic forms, but still with the black line and black shapes. By the end of the decade, she's really going back, she's going into color. It's very lyrical. And then this is an installation view of some of the works at the Parish Museum, where she had rediscovered, if you will, Mondrian and neoplasticism, and it came out in her work. And it says, as it says in the quote, I remember Mondrian was the one for me that sort of opened things up. And then what's interesting with that show at the Parish Museum showed several of these works, and I think you have some at the Leiber, and that have titles. She didn't commonly title her pieces. They're mostly untitled or maybe numbered, but this Azolla, I had to look it up, but a lot of the paintings seem to have plant names. So Azolla, I looked up, was a water fern of some kind that's native to the Northeast. So this was already happening in the 70s, later in her life. So then we turn to James Brooks. Oh, and I forgot to mention regarding the nature part of it, she was an avid observer of nature, especially birds. And at the Leiber, there is a journal with her writings, and she just kept daily observations. Some were really mundane, but saw a blue jay today, and you know, that kind of thing. But some of it is really special. So we turn to Jim. So as I was saying, Jim's work definitely took precedence in the couple's life, and Charlotte retreated from exhibiting to support her husband. By 1963, he had a retrospective at the Whitney Museum, actually, which would travel, and he would exhibit broadly through the 80s. Now, they both had careers as graphic artists. Jim actually had been a World War II combat artist also, and then also he, as many artists did of the time, worked with the WPA, Federal Art Project, so he had done murals. The one that's most significant and exists to this day is Flight at the LaGuardia Airport Marine Air Terminal, which is spectacular, but it's very different from the work that you're going to see in the examples I'm going to show. It's tied to his earlier social realist paintings, and he was an excellent artist. Oh, I forgot to mention also, he, obviously he was tied to the first generation of abstract expressionists, and he was included even in that renowned 9th Street show in 1951, which Pollock and Klein and Motherwell were all in. So this is, what is this, 1951? So as I was saying, he was a classically trained artist, but he was always experimenting, and he was always experimenting with styles and methods and materials that helped him to achieve varying results, including dripping and staining techniques and calligraphic forms. So this is an example of that. Then there's this, which you'll see it says oil on Osnaburg canvas, and that's a canvas that it's like coarsely woven, and he used it in its raw canvas. It's like, I guess, a flax. And he used this because he could sort of paint and it would seep through, and then he would actually really use the other side as the front of the canvas. And
It's textured, right? That material.
it is, and I think this piece in the Parish Museum, when it was exhibited, they had the retrospective in 2023, I think it was. They had it so that you could see both recto and verso. Yes, yes. He actually credits Pollock for encouraging him to employ a more gestural style. This one is actually in your show, which is a beautiful one. And so beginning in the 40s, he had developed this moody atmospheric style, and I wanted to include this one because I hope you will go see it in person. This is actually in the Guildhall collection, and we're lucky to have it exhibited now at the Leiber. And then 1961, he really bursts into bold colors and forms. So you really see there's like a stylistic, constant progression change. And here's an installation view of that exhibition at the Parish Museum, because he said painting is a real thing, and that's why they titled it that way. So, and I love this picture. This is a picture that was, as it says there, taken in 1980 by Timothy Greenfield Sanders. Jim and Charlotte both had Alzheimer's disease later in life, and he succumbed to his illness in 1992, and Charlotte lived out the remainder of her life at Neck Path until 2010. Although they had created a foundation for their work, they did not make provisions for their home and studios. They had no children. I'm not sure if it was a choice, or we do have a talk coming up on Sunday at the Leiber Collection. I invite you all, which is a conversation between Mike Solomon and Christine Berry from Barry Campbell Gallery. And Mike Solomon, Sid Solomon's son, Sid and Annie Solomon, had a very close relationship with Charlotte and Jim, and he will have, the conversations about his recollections of spending a lot of time with them. So he was like their adopted son. So I often wonder whether it was something that they just couldn't have children rather than that it was a choice. But they didn't have children, and the relatives that they did have, sadly, I think the niece inherited the house and the property, but she died within a year. She had cancer and just tragically died, and I think the husband also died. And so it was just this whole perfect storm where they left the house, as you saw in that picture of the studio. Basically, it was like it was intact, as if they had just left. And so the property was sold to the town, but there were no stipulations regarding its stewardship, unfortunately. So I guess it was the best outcome because we could have had a big house with a tennis court there today. But we have this. So this actually, I included this picture because Helen Harrison was the one that wrapped this house and said, don't demo, because in 2020, when the town was again approaching this decision of demolishing the structures, Helen, and they were going to do it, they had the resolution, Helen Harrison came to request that this little house, because Lee and Jackson had stayed in it on occasion, that she would take this house and put it here. So at least save a portion of the history of this place. But that didn't have to happen, fortunately, because there was a stay of demolition. Nonetheless, there it is, the sign remains. And what I will say is that, let's count, 2013, we're now at 2025, it's over a decade, despite pleas at various intervals from private and public individuals and organizations, including Preservation Long Island, Preservation League of New York State, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, all urging the town to restore the buildings for community enjoyment, because after all, it's public land and we're supposed to be able to enjoy this. And mind you, these 11 acres are there are trails, walking trails, hiking trails that run all through this. You can walk to Amagansett from here. They have not done anything. The town has not proceeded to with any restoration. And the structures are just increasingly deteriorating due to this decade of neglect, decay, vandalism, lots of vandalism, and deferred maintenance, to be kind. They are, in the words of some public officials, an attractive nuisance. Love that. So this brings me to the Brooks Park Arts and Nature Center. So we believe firmly that there is the potential to stabilize and restore this site, to create a place for art, nature, learning, contemplation. All of that celebrates Charlotte and Jim's legacy. Their home and studios is a physical testament of their lives and work. And this happened to show you that public opinion does matter. In 2022, on a really cold, very, very cold February day, over 125 persons gathered for a hike at the Brooks Park site. And this was organized by East Hampton Trails Preservation Society in partnership with Brooks Park Arts and Nature. And for us, it was an overwhelming demonstration of the community interest and support for the site. And for Charlotte and Jim. I mean, really it becomes sort of, this place is an extension of their lives. There is strength in numbers, everybody. I'm gonna ask every single one of you. Power of public opinion, you can't underestimate it. So we continue to ask community members to send letters, to make comments to the town board, speak to them and support this project. Because beyond celebrating Charlotte and Jim, the preservation of the site will provide jobs, drive tourism, as this place does, as your place does, the Leiber Collection, and offer opportunities for learning and appreciating the artistic, cultural, and natural history of East Hampton through this legacy, this very unique legacy of Charlotte and Jim. And this was just in August, so more people that came for another hike, and I hope you will all visit.
Where is it?
So Neck Path,
Yeah, no, no.
it's, since the 11 acres were sort of 3 lots in a way, it's all one lot, it's not subdivided, but it was sort of sold as 124, 126, and 128. So the address we use is 128. But if you enter that into Google Maps or what do you call it? GPS, it takes you to the wrong place. It takes you to the other side, I think. So The best way that I can say is if you were at the Leiber, if you're at, I still call it Marty's Deli on Old Stone Highway, and you go from Marty's Deli toward coming here, it'll be on your left. And there is currently, it's like one of those split rail fence entrances that demarcates the entrance, that driveway that I showed you at the beginning. So it's really, it just doesn't have a big sign, but it does have a community preserve, not a community preserve sign. It says, I think it is a community preserve sign.
If you're at Hat, the beginning of it is on Old Stone Highway.
Yes, the other end, yes, where whatever the deli is called now,
Okay,
yes.
now keep going west, and what happens?
It's gonna be on your left.
How far down?
Not that far.
Less than a mile.
Yeah, not very far.
From here, is it before Marty's Deli?
No.
No,
Oh,
no. No, sorry, it is before. Yes, from here it is before. Yes,
Oh, oh.
yes, forgive me. From here it is before. Yeah.
But you really don't see anything as you're driving by.
So yeah, this
So
is,
you won't see a sign.
What
or-
is
you don't see the,
marker? Is there a marker of some?
like I said, there's the entrance, the driveway, and there's a split rail fence, and there's a sign that says, I think, community preserve. This is the thing that is so interesting, and which I mentioned earlier, is they chose this site, and they didn't put their house right on the road. Their house is set in, the house is this on the right here, which you may be able to see the remnants. I mean, this is part of that. The middle section there was what you saw on the bluff in Montauk. And then they added to the right and they added to the left. You have to walk a bit in, yes.
What about Red Dirt Road? Why is that?
It's-
by February?
It's sort of, so Red Dirt Road, I think is,
On the other side.
It's parallel.
yeah, but it's this, if you do the Google map thing or whatever, it kind of takes you Red Dirt Road, which messes everything up. Yeah,
It's
Yeah.
not there.
it's not, no. That's sort of behind it, yeah.
What's the estimate on the restoration?
So I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I think it's somewhere in the range of $4 million.
What do you get for that?
Well, at this point, that was in 2023, so it's probably going to be more, one. Two, if the town is paying for it with the RFP process and like the, what is it called, the wage thing, prevailing wage, everything costs more.
And slower.
And is slower, yes. But nothing's impossible, and what we think should be done is to restore the house first, which is an easier lift. Unfortunately, as I said, it was vandalized, so now it has, all the windows need to be replaced. I mean, this literally in 2013, when the town purchased it, was not in great condition, but it was usable with not a lot of work to do on it. Now it's a much heavier lift. Yeah.
You feel the town is letting it go?
On purpose?
Yeah, they're just letting it go.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
$30 million senior center.
Well, yes, don't get me started, no. But you see on the left, the picture on the left, that's the studio. You see how the roof is curving? It's collapsing. So, yeah, so it's not in good shape, but the good news is it's not marble. It's not really expensive materials. So it's shingle, it's hardy board, it's materials that are not much. So, yeah.
Is NISCA able to get a
Yes.
capital
So
improvement grant?
so yes, that
$5 million?
so please write a letter, because what we would really, what we need is to have site control. So Brooks Park Arts and Nature Center has the need to have a license agreement, because then we would be able to, for instance, maybe apply for a NISCA grant with the town, but nonetheless, we could do it.
Local money released for capital work for the arts, right? Did you see that? I'll send it to you. She just released a huge amount of money for capital campaigns for arts works.
Yeah, that's great, but really, and I don't know, and Sarah, my co-president, is back there and is more of an expert on this, but I think without the license agreement, which is basically like a lease, our hands are tied to raise any kind of money. And what we're asking the town to do is to at least set aside a small sum and show some forward movement, sign the license agreement, and then we can
You have to
go.
own the property, or you have to have a lease longer than 11 years.
10 years license agreement would be sufficient.
So next is the Leiber Collection. And Anne Fristow Stewart, the director, gave a talk on Friday night.
There's a lot of similarities and a lot of differences in our stories, but, sorry, I'm gonna set this here. We're good? Okay. So at the Leiber Collection, we're dedicated to continuing the life and legacy of Judith and Gerson Leiber, this extraordinary art couple who lived and worked here in Springs for over half a century. Through our exhibitions, gardens, and programs, we celebrate not only their accomplishments, but also other creatives who have flourished here on the East End. Think of Thomas and Mary Nemo Moran, to Jackson Pollock, Pollock-Krasner, Charlotte Park and James Brooks, Elaine and Willem de Kooning, Connie Fox and Bill King. East Hampton has always been a haven for creatives where romance and art intertwine. Judith Petto was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1921 into a Jewish family that was well-to-do, sophisticated, and cultured. I'm going to move this a little bit.
That's really heavy.
There, I'm good.
You
Now,
want me to move it?
No, this is good.
Okay, 'cause it's really heavy.
she was brilliant, elegant, and determined, but both privilege and peril marked her youth. As the Holocaust spread across Europe and the freedom of Jews became severely limited, she trained in the Hungarian Handbag Makers Guild, first as the first female apprentice, then journeyman, and ultimately a master handbag designer, in hopes that the skills would help her find a way out of Hungary. She used to say, "Hitler made me a handbag designer." Even while in the Jewish ghetto, with bombs exploding all around her, she designed handbags in her head to stay sane. Gerson Leiber was born in 1921 during the Great Depression in Brooklyn, New York, and moved to Titusville, Pennsylvania at the age of 3. He was the oldest of 5 children, with a father who was a junk dealer and a mother who was a homemaker. He was a small-town boy, and even though he showed great talent in art as a young student, his parents did not feel this was a means to a job and discouraged him from pursuing art. So he began working as a typesetter at the Titusville Herald. At 19, he joined the United States Army and served in Northern Africa and Italy, and was eventually sent to Budapest in 1945. It was then that Judy met an American soldier who called himself Gus, and as the story goes, it was love at first sight. I heard this in another story. He invited her to the opera, which was one of her greatest loves, and from that moment, their story began. They married in 1946 and came to New York on a bride ship the following year. They were delighted to be in New York. Gerson said, "It was our promised land." And Judith said, "The memory of the Holocaust was burned into our consciousness, and we were relieved to be away from the land where it occurred." In New York City, they worked their way up the ladders of success. Judy was a phenomenon. New York was emerging as the new fashion capital, and she was the only woman handbag designer in America. Her skills became highly sought after, and before long, she was hired by Nettie Rosenstein. Yeah. Thanks. She was hired by Nettie Rosenstein, the finest ladies' couture designer in America. In 1952, she designed the handbag for First Lady Mamie Eisenhower's inauguration gown. From then on, nearly every First Lady carried a Judith Leiber bag on Inauguration Day. Her. Yep, that's them all. The only one that didn't was Rosalind Carter, because she never wanted anything that was ostentatious, or she was very understated, but all of the rest had, yeah. I love this photo so much. Hermanodier's, those sparkling crystal-covered clutches, became icons, not just purses, but widely considered works of art. I'll just show you a few of them real quick. At the same time, Gus studied at the Art Students League. He painted and made prints of New York's skyline, rooftops and bridges, fashion models, and their party people, as he called them, or paparazzi. This monkey is the paparazzi. Later, he developed luminous abstractions inspired by the gardens he loved. They were different kinds of artists: Judith, a designer of artful handbags, and Gus, a fine artist, creating paintings, prints, and sculptures. But their dialogue with each other's work lasted more than 70 years. Like many artists, the Leibers discovered Springs in the 1950s. They were drawn by the quiet, the community, and the extraordinary East Hampton light. They bought a farmhouse on Old Stone Highway in 1956. What started as a summer retreat became a lifelong home. Gus gardened, painted, and built aviaries for his prized pigeons. Judith designed handbags in her upstairs bedroom studio. So very similar. Gus had the huge studio. Together, they developed a compound that included gardens, a magnificent art studio with great light, and eventually a museum. And importantly, they were not isolated. They were part of that same network of couples who shaped Springs. Just down the road, Krasner and earlier Pollock were redefining painting. James Brooks and Charlotte Park were experimenting in abstraction. The Leibers added fashion and design to that vibrant mix. In 1963, Gus encouraged Judy to start her own business. He told her, "You're not going to work for these schnooks anymore. You're going into business." And she did. From a tiny loft on Madison Avenue, Judith Leiber Handbags Incorporated was born. And while Judy designed dazzling bags, Gus made paintings and prints inspired by the fashion world they were living in. The handbags became world famous. They were carried at the opera, on red carpets, in the White House, and are now in the collections of the Metropolitan, the Victoria and Albert, and the Smithsonian, to name a few. This was Queen Elizabeth's bag. So she had one Judith Leiber. Gus continued to make lyrical abstractions, paintings he described as a long search for clarity, honesty, and beauty. Together, their work embodies that rare synergy that Harold Coda at the Met once described as a beautiful resonance of aesthetic interests, a mutual love of brilliant color and rigorous structure. In 2005, they opened the Leiber Collection, a Renaissance-style museum Gus designed as a tribute to Judy. It is not only a museum, but also a love story, built of brick and filled with art. Both Judy and Gus passed away within hours of each other in April of 2018, after 73 years of marriage. Their story joins the lineage of Pollock and Krasner, Brooks and Park, and so many other art pairs who made East Hampton their creative home. As writer Mary Gregory put it, in their early days, each of them saw pain and suffering. For the rest of their lives, Gerson and Judith Leiber defined their own realities by seeking, cultivating, and producing beauty through an enduring, inspiring love for each other and for life. And that, I think, is the true legacy of East Hampton's arts couples. They remind us that art is not just about individual genius. It is about the love, trust, and partnership that sustains creativity. Thank you. I did try to keep it at 10 minutes, so yeah,
Do you know if, because I saw that both James and Gus were at the art,
they were.
do we know if they had any crossover there?
They did, and they were friends. Yeah, and they print. Yes, they printed together. Gus, I'm not sure.
Oh, I think for the Art Students League, Jim was much
Different
older,
timing.
and so I think he was there like in the late 20s. So
Oh, the 20s? Oh,
I think that was like the.
okay.
But as neighbors, most certainly they befriended each other, and they
Yeah.
I mean they basically, you said 1956, so they moved to Springs at the same time.
They did, and the Leibers were coming out since the early 50s, but renting. So they were out here throughout the 50s, and then bought the farmhouse in 56. So, yeah. Yes,
Are they selling a house on the,
they are selling the house.
that's their house?
Yes.
Residence?
Yes. Yeah. Somebody back there? Yes?
My parents were born the same generation. My mom was born in 1925 and my dad in 1923. And my mother had a saying where she would often say that it took two to make one. She was raised
Oh.
with that. She's a brilliant historian and writer in her own right, but it was my father's career that she really threw her energy behind. It was a common thing, and it was how she was raised.
Yeah.
But it created terrible tension, right, and lack of self-purpose and agency. And I'm just curious about, like, the role of these women, you know, how they sort of, if there was any scholarship, any kind of discussion with them at the time where they're talking about the true nature of their experience.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the Leiber's case, it was flipped because Judith Leiber was the one that was the most successful. And Gus really, he was delighted to put her career first. You know, it was 1963 when they started the business. Typically, the business would have the man's name on it. It would rarely have the woman's name. But he was delighted to have it be Judith Leiber. He fully recognized that she was the creative genius in design, and also she had an incredible business sense. Her father was a very successful businessman. Her grandmother had a very successful ladies' hat factory in Vienna when she was growing up, and she had a great aunt and uncle that had a very successful cosmetics company. So she was surrounded by very smart business people. Yeah, she was lucky to have survived. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I had to keep my talk to 10 minutes, so I had to leave out a whole lot. No, but yeah, I mean, she was lucky to have survived. She, you know, came over to America after having met Gus Leiber and really just changed fashion history in America. She's a national treasure. Which is so interesting because she's Hungarian, and you know she got a proclamation making her and the Leiber Collection national treasures. So she really did create just incredible beauty, but yeah, it's flipped in that way. They also had no children, so you know, it's interesting that none of these couples had children. But yeah, it was definitely flipped. And you know, Gus was in all of the he's, you know, in the collections around the globe. But it's like with our show right now with Charlotte Park and James Brooks, people are like, well, you know, they weren't as famous as Pollock. And I'm like, nobody's as famous as Pollock, right? And the same, right. But it's the same with Judith Leiber. Like, she's very famous in the fashion world. And so, you know, people measure that and say, well, Gus wasn't as famous, but he also wanted her to shine. They were each other's greatest fans and were so devoted to one another. So,
How did they end up, this is not to be, how did they end up dying within minutes of each other?
So people ask that a lot. We knew that she was leaving us. She was so they died in April of 2018. In March, we were in the city at Sotheby's at a brunch in her honor. When we got back, she started having the many TIAs, which really very quickly incapacitated her. And Gus, although he seemed very healthy, he was super strong and fit. He exercised every day. his heart was just breaking. And, you know, I do believe you can die of a broken heart, because he called me on the Friday before they passed away, and he said that his heart hurt in the night. And he had been diagnosed with congestive heart disease 2 years earlier, but that doesn't make your heart hurt. It just does, you know, makes you not beat properly, and you might fill up with fluids, but he was managing that really well with his doctor. And so we got to the hospital, and the doctor ran tests, and they said his heart rate was low, but we had nurses at the house, and he said, and all he wanted to do was get back to her. He did not want to leave her for a minute. So they said, go back home. He went home, and the nurses were to take his blood pressure every hour. And they said if it gets below a certain amount, then bring him back. So it didn't go below that certain amount, and he went to sleep at, like, I think the nurses said at midnight, and when they checked on him at 5 a.m, he had passed away in his sleep. But for her, she had declined so quickly, and the last 4 days she had not woken up. And so they checked her after he had passed, and they said her heart rate is strong. She's not going anywhere. But then she breathed her last breath about 5 hours later. So yeah, I know nothing about what happens after death, but I had this vision of Gus, like when she started her business, he was like, you know, come on, you're starting the business. I just had this vision of him going, come on, Judy, it's not that bad, let's go. And, you know, in our minds, we like to think they're, you know, off somewhere together on their next adventure. But it's very cool. The Jewish cemetery on Old Stone Highway allowed them to be buried in the same grave, which is not tradition at all. They are in their own caskets, but they are in one grave because they had been together for so long and were able to be buried together. So, but yeah, talk about shock. I mean, it was horrible for those of us that were here, but at the same time, very poetic and kind of like, if you have to go, like, isn't that a good way? And neither were here, you know, devastated by the loss of the other. Yeah.
How old were they?
She was 97 and he was 96. So they had lived a very long, wonderful life. We were shooting for over 100. I know, don't we all? But his mentor and art professor at the Art Students League, Will Barnett, lived to be 103, I think. And another friend of theirs had lived to 103. So that was sort of our mantras, like, let's get to 100, and at least 100. Let's try for 103. But yeah, it didn't happen. So.
We're so lucky to be able to be in these spaces, right, where these beautiful, talented, whimsy spirits have been. We're so
Yeah, I know.
Touch that and learn
Yeah.
about it. You're amazing, all of you.
Well, I was saying when we drove up, we've always parked on the street, but now there's this like parking lot.
I didn't even know.
And we got here early and we're driving up like we're driving up the driveway, and we're like, hi, Jackson. Hi, Lee. We're here. You know, it was like this totally different experience.
Sitting a friend.
Yeah.
You feel like you know them. So I wanted to give the biggest
Yes.